just want to give a little introduction. Some of you have heard me give this before, but it's about why we do survey and inventory. We sponsor it through the city. This year, we got a grant for $15,000 from the state to survey Sehome, the rest of the Sehome neighborhood that hasn't been done in the past. This map shows that area. Back in 1999, some of you might even been involved in this. The Sehome History Group, these guys, got together. It was a grassroots effort. It took 2 years to do research. They had a lot of fun. They got really into it. They came up with a book as one of their products at Home on the Hill. I have a copy here that has a lot of history of the neighborhood and individual houses. So that was a survey in itself. And then they went another step farther and went and nominated a National Historic District, which was accepted in 2001. So they really led the charge in this area. So this area was not, the information isn't online now, and we're working to get some of that loaded up. But we didn't include this in the survey since they've already given themselves a leg up. So what we looked at was the area not surveyed. We surveyed in 2012 the downtown area, and we tried to include parts of Sehome, and we ended up getting this little piece right here because this was kind of part of downtown. So the rest of it is what our team has been surveying here. So one of the things, I had a couple quotes. I got this quote in this picture of Harriet Spinell sitting on her stoop from American Bungalow magazine. Carol Yoon, one of the neighbors who kind of led the charge, sent a article to American Bungalow. It was published, and one of the quotes from a neighbor was that it made them all look at their neighborhood in a new way, because back over 10 years ago, Sehome wasn't always the esteemed area that it is now. It was kind of looked on as, well, there's a lot of student housing there, a lot of rentals. Sure, it's old, but so this, the survey, the nomination, it really helped give people more information about the neighborhood and a better understanding. So what we've asked the consultants to do is to, when we do survey, we look at the highest standard, and that's the National Register of Historic Places standard. That's set by the National Park Service. So that's the highest standard, and you would think that it would be the most restrictive, but it's not. It's the least restrictive of any register. It is honorary. It doesn't mean that you can't tear your house down if you've listed your building or a district. There aren't any regulations unless you're putting federal money into it, because the federal government they have to stand by their own rules. If you're going to put their money into it, you have to follow some of their rules. But that's very rarely the case with a private property owner. The National Register, if you're listed or in a district, there are incentives. Often your property values tend to go up. There's grants. You're eligible for grants that you wouldn't normally be eligible for if you weren't in a district or a listed building. And then there's some tax incentives at the federal level. So I just want to remind everyone, as you're listening to the team talk about this survey, again, this is information only. We're not listing anything right now. We are looking at the National Register level, and we're assuming that anything that is eligible for the National Register would also be eligible for the state and the local registers. But we're not going to talk about that too much tonight. I just wanted to show you this map. Back when I moved here in '99, the Eldridge Historic District and Fairhaven were the only two historic districts in Bellingham. And then in that same year, I met Carol Yoon and got to know what these guys were doing in the Sehome Historic District. And since that time, the city has helped sponsor a number of surveys and historic districts in South Hill, York, the Leonard Streets, and Cornwall Park neighborhoods. And then another effort down in downtown. So the city's really kind of stepped up. This is a quote from Merrill Peterson saying how it was a huge shot in the arm for the neighborhood's self-esteem to be listed as a National Register district. So why we survey? We want to create a snapshot in time. We all love looking at historic photographs, but somebody's got to take that photograph. So it takes that foresight to like capture it in time and then move on. We're identifying historic buildings and districts to help people realize, hey, I have a historic building. So we're putting information out there. We're sharing it with property owners. We've got it online. You can contact me. You can come into the permit center. There are a lot of different ways to get the information from the survey. A lot of our planners have started using the information that's gathered in these historic surveys. So it's really great for future planning efforts. And then finally, City Council recognizes how important to a sense of place preserving our historic buildings and cultural resources are. So now I'm going to introduce the survey team. We've got Historic Preservation Northwest all the way from Albany, Oregon. They worked, you might recognize Dave Pinyard and Bernadette Niederer. From a couple years ago, they were awarded the contract for the Preserve America grant, which we did a couple of years ago. It was a 2-year project. It was huge. They did a great job. Through that, they recruited volunteers, and 2 volunteers, were you volunteering for that then? Colby Labrie and Lynette Felber, who are now associates for Historic Preservation Northwest, started as volunteers. Colby has since begun to be paid. And Lynette now, too. Yeah, and Lynette went on and got her master's in historic preservation. So it's just feel good all around. City of Bellingham staff, we love to contribute. So Kate Newell, she makes amazing maps and does a lot of analytical work in GIS. And Jeff Jewell, who we all know and love. And then Brent Bodie, he's not here tonight, but he went out, he was an intern, and he went out and took a lot of great historic photos of outbuildings from the alleys. So I'm going to stop talking now and I'm going to let the team talk. So I think, Lynette, you're first, yeah?
One of the things that we were doing at the same time we were starting the survey was to look at the history of the town of Sehome. It's useful to look at the history of the original town in order to understand how the current configuration of the neighborhood developed. You are all probably familiar with the master narrative of Bellingham's history, how Bellingham developed out of 4 settlement towns who were all in rivalry and finally consolidated in 1904. But the histories look very different when you examine the lens of each individual town. Here we see 2 of the towns, Whatcom and Sehome. Both were founded to take advantage of natural resources and make a fortune, or try to make a fortune, out of the bounty of the Pacific Northwest. Whatcom's story of origin involves Captain Roeder and how he and Russell Peabody started a lumber mill to harness the power of Whatcom Falls. The story of Sehome is that of Captain Roeder's employees who were logging in the area that would become Sehome and discovered coal amid the roots of a fallen cedar tree. And that was the beginning of the coal mine that was the start of the city or the town of Sehome. This is a sketch of the early Sehome that is attributed to Colonel Pickett. You see Main Street, which developed into Elk Street, which developed into State Street. It was renamed in 1926. One of the things that's interesting about this sketch is the building marked number 1 was the original Sehome Hotel. And many local historians say that Teresa Eldridge cooked for the coal miners in this building. So that's one interesting detail. What we saw in the survey was, was that the neighborhood developed chronologically. We begin with the earliest part here, the original town of Sehome, which I showed you in the previous slide, which developed in the mid-1850s. And then by the 1880s, the development began to move north in a commercial district that goes about to Holly Street. Then we skipped over this for the survey because it was already a district, a national registered district. And we focused on the third area, which is around Samish Way. And this area was developed more recently, beginning about in the 1930s, and is associated with road and highway development. Some of the early influences on the town of Sehome were first and foremost the Bellingham Bay Coal Company. This was in existence for about 20 years. At the height of its productivity, 100 men were employed. Most of the coal was sent to San Francisco, which is where the investors were from. The company brought in P.B. Cornwall. You probably know his name from Cornwall Street, which was previously Dock Street. And he was very involved in not only the coal company, but other endeavors in Sehome as it developed. But unfortunately, the mine was plagued with problems. They had cave-ins, they had fires, they had flooding, and finally the quality of the coal was not sufficiently good, so they finally closed that mine. And after the closure, there was a huge outflow of the population because most of the population had been transient labor who was working in the coal mines, and then there was no longer any employment for them. About the same time, the Rotor Mill burned down too. So these were very bleak times in the city that would become Bellingham, and a real lack of employment. There was also a brief influx for the Fraser Gold Rush in British Columbia. People came to Sehome to buy supplies. It was good for the merchants to sell things to the gold miners, but unfortunately that ended when it was required that permits be purchased in Victoria, so there was no reason for people to come through Sehome or Whatcom anymore. The dock was also important. The dock was built very early in Sehome's history to transport the coal that was mined to San Francisco, which was its primary market. And that dock persisted after the end of the coal mine. And Sehome is also notable for having the very first school in the four settlement towns in 1861. That was a school where initially Edward Eldridge taught coal miners, and also many of the original settlers' children, such as Lottie Roder Roth, were educated. It's no longer standing, unfortunately, but there's a model of it in the Old City Hall Museum. This shows some of the activity around the Sehome dock. The lower photo was taken in 1900. We see it was a place for ships to land. By this time, it also had railroad cars. It's where the mail was delivered in the early days, and Sehome was the first town to have a telegraph. So Sehome was distinct in several ways. But still, these early photos from the 1880s and 90s show that development was pretty slow compared to what we might see on the East Coast. In 1885, Sehome still had a dirt road. This is the road that became Elk Street and then State Street, and we could see that the settlement pretty much ends around Maple Street, where we still have forest. But by the 1890s, we see something that looks like a modern city. This is looking the opposite direction, going south up State Street to the residential section. We see that we have planked streets, planked sidewalks, and here we have the second Sehome Hotel, which is 4 stories and has modern conveniences such as electricity and calling tubes and an elevator. After the coal mine closed, Pierre Cornwall and his investors reincorporated and started the Bellingham Bay Improvement Company. And this was a company dedicated to speculation and doing anything they could to benefit from the over 3,000 acres that they had purchased for the coal mine. So they were involved in logging. You could see all the stumps that were left. They were involved in selling commercial property, and by 1900 they were also selling residential properties. Cornwall had his finger in everything, and he also got federal land grants and started the Bellingham Bay and British Columbia Railroad. And he built 56 miles of track from what was then New Whatcom in 1883 to the Burrard Inlet in British Columbia by 1891 to connect with the Canadian Railroad. So that was another advantage for the area that is the Sehome neighborhood today. There was a huge real estate boom in 1888 and 1889, a very prosperous period. Investors were coming in from as far away as Portland and Seattle and buying up lots, which were selling for sometimes $1,000. This is one of the most enduring real estate firms, Jones and Carleon. We see their office here, and this is Holly Street. So they were attracting investors and selling lots. In this later period, too, at the end of the 19th century, we see Sehome moving northward. This is the Bellingham Bay National Bank on the corner of Elk and Holly Street. You'll recognize, or won't recognize, the lot today as the place where Saturna Capital Investment is located. So this is maybe even more a banking corridor today. Also, I don't know if you've heard this story before, but when this building was demolished, the arches were removed in a WPAA project, and they were used to create the Whatcom Falls Bridge, which is still there today in the park. So recycling started longer ago than we think. Another influence on the Sehome development, especially towards the north end, was the development of two early streetcar lines. Here we see a Birney car, which according to Jeff Jewell was popular because it only required a single operator. And we see it on probably Elk Street at that time, in front of the Dahlquist building, which is where the Dashi Noodle is today, in that building. But before the streetcars came in, there was residential development going in because a lot of Sehome was a walking suburb. People wanted to be able to walk to their places of employ. And so for merchants, upper-class businessmen, places like North Garden Street and State Street became desirable residential neighborhoods as early as the 1890s. This is the Morse House, and of course Robert Morse was the owner of the Morse hardware store. This portion is still standing today, and this portion has been demolished. At one point he owned about an entire block there. One other point that's interesting is both the Morse House and this house, which you may recognize, the Morgan Mansion, were houses derived from pattern books. So they were not designed by local architects, but were taken from previously designed models. Garden was a sort of street who's who of the movers and shakers of early Bellingham. This house you all recognize, I think, today. It's now called the Donovan House. It's painted blue. But it was first the house of Edwin Fisher, who was an engineer with Cornwall's Railroad. J.J. Donovan was involved in many, many enterprises, including the Donovan Blodell Mill. And of course, we're going to be hearing a lot about Donovan in the next week because Brian Griffin is putting together a series of exhibits at the Whatcom Museum. His partner, Julius Blodell, lived in the house at the top. The blue house at the bottom belonged to Bernard and Anna Montague. Montague was a partner in the Montague and McHugh dry goods companies. They had several locations, but the one that is notable today is the department store that they built on the corner of Commercial and Magnolia, which is the pink terracotta Crown Plaza building today, and that's, of course, still standing. And the Lee brothers were involved in wholesale grocery business, and they had houses next door to each other on North Garden. And these houses are both still next to each other. You can see this one is this one, only in color. In the 1920s, we see a hotel and commercial corridor developing on what is by now State Street. We could see the Bellingham Herald, so that marks the change. Here we see again the Dahlquist building with the Antlers Hotel. This is the current YMCA, which was at this time the Hotel Henry, which was converted to a hotel to serve the Tulip Festival tourists. And then we have the Lowbay Hotel down here, the Columbia Hotel here. So it was a very popular place for traveling salesmen. In the 20s, we also see apartment houses being built in the Sehome neighborhood. This is my favorite resource from the survey. This apartment was designed by local architect T.F. Doan for Molly Treeseyes. Molly was a local businesswoman and an artist. She taught china painting to women so they would have product to sell to make a living. Other apartment buildings, the Colshan is, I think, the earliest one we saw in the survey, 1919. And of course, the Alamo, you probably all recognize, an exotic building with an exotic name. The primary influence probably today on the neighborhood is Western Washington. This is a photo from 1938. You'll see the old university at the top, Old Main. This is High Street. Here we have Garden Street, and this is the back of the Sehome apartments. What's different is this entire area of residential housing was removed, and this is where the Viking Union was built in 1959. So we can see that the mixed-use neighborhood developed as it evolved over the years. Resources were lost as others were built. And I'm turning the podium over to Colby Labrie.
I'm going to talk about another campus that sort of grew and shaped the neighborhood, affected some of the local housing, which was St. Luke's Hospital, which if some people might remember St. Luke's, we used to have two choices. You had a Catholic and a Protestant hospital choice, and St. Luke's was up on the corner of Jersey and Key Streets, not Key, Chestnut. And so the hospitals have since then combined, and it's now part of St. Joseph's Hospital as well. But so it started out long ago in the early 1890s. It actually was in a hotel in downtown Bellingham. They didn't even have their own building until 1895. They built the top one you see here. And this was on the location that it is today, on the corner of Jersey and Chestnut. And so by 10 years later, they built this nice big hospital expansion, and the smaller building became the nurses' quarters. And then by 1920s, we had an addition, a brick addition, which you can see here in this picture, and that's still there today. And that was designed by Stanley F. Piper, and that's him right there. And he's done a lot of buildings around Bellingham you may know of, like the Herald Building and Columbia School, and some other ones. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Also, all of the hospital's various expansions had displaced some houses, such as when they put a parking lot in the 80s, there was a lot of buildings torn down. Some were actually moved after people protested. And there's currently some boarded up houses around the hospital today. And then looking up the hill, when we were talking earlier about Garden Street, another area that was sort of a place for a lot of the movers and shakers to build homes was up the hill on State Street. So going up Elk, up the hill in the area of the Armory. And one of the interesting buildings we found, we sort of concentrated on this area because there was a lot of interesting buildings. And this one at 510 North State Street was actually built as a rectory for the original Church of the Assumption, which you see here. And here's the rectory in the picture. And the church sold the property in the 1920s and was torn down before 1930. But the rectory remains. It's still there. And some other interesting homes up in this area include 512 North State, which was the home of one of the Roll brothers, which he had a business down on State Street with his brother, Charles, and they were Germans, and they originally lived above their business, and then they were able to make a good bit of money and build some nice houses elsewhere in town, and this was one of them. And another interesting house up on North State is the Dahlquist House, which Lynette mentioned the Dahlquist building where the Dashi Noodle Bar is. That was one of Thomas Dahlquist's buildings that had a lot of real estate. You can see this house, here it is now, and I believe it's a college rental or apartments, but it lost its nice two-story ornate wraparound porch. Well, it retains part of it, actually. It's been enclosed on the top. It was a pretty cool house. And of course, the Armory is a big one up there on the hill. And it was built in 1910. It's built of Chuckanut sandstone. The cost was $75,000. It's a 60,000 square foot building. It was constructed for the Washington National Guard. It was designed by the architectural firm of Blackwell and Baker of Seattle, but the local architect T.F. Doan was hired as the supervising on-site architect. The first floor was a rifle range and storage. The second floor was used for drilling and offices, and the third floor was a viewing gallery. Probably a lot of people here remember it as a roller rink, which it was converted to in 1953 and was run as a roller rink for over 36 years. So a lot of memories of that. It was forced to close from the water damage from the building in 1989. And today it's being used for storage. It's owned by Western Washington University. And another interesting area of the neighborhood, which is actually very distinct, I guess both geographically, architecturally, and historically speaking, is the Samish Way area. It really, originally, it was just a rural route paved with gravel. In the 1930s, it was the Maple Valley Road, and became in the mid to late 30s part of Highway 99 or Pacific Highway 1. And you can see here in this picture, this is looking down Maple, where Ellis turns off, so we're looking north to the right, and it's telling you that go that way to the city center and to Mount Baker and Vancouver. So this was a major highway that came right through town and went through downtown and out DuPont and out Northwest and Maplewood and on to Canada. So that was a major sort of influence, having that highway going through town on the businesses along the highway. And so for Samish Way, same thing. You can see here, this picture is from the 50s, and this shows where I-5 is going to come through. Someone just kind of drew this in or painted it in. And it's kind of an interesting picture. You can still see the little rural highway. There's not much happening there. There's a little tiny, you can see here, the site of the Aloha Hotel. There was a little motor hotel there dating from the 40s. And so I-5, basically Eisenhower, after 1955, he was funding the National Interstate Defense Highways. So it was basically escape routes for atomic bombs. And we didn't get I-5 up here until a later sort of phase of the federal highway program, and it occurred between 53 and 66, so it went in phases. And in this shot from 1963, you can see now the Aloha Hotel is fully there. You've got a big, huge trailer court happening here. A lot of little roadside businesses have cropped up. And here's I-5, still no Bellingham Mall. But so the automobile era was a big player in the Samish Way area. So you have all these little, a few remnants of the first businesses to sort of cater to that, where tourists were looking for inexpensive lodging near the road. So you had a couple of early motels that survived. We have the Aloha Motel, which is still there. Both of these are the Aloha. And the Bell Motel is now the Cascade Inn. And it's sort of gone through a series of remodels, but some of it remains there. And so one thing we noticed around the Samish Way area was, especially up around 34th Street, there was a lot of houses that definitely were old, architecturally, vintage-wise, but when we looked at some of these aerial maps, they're not there. So I had about a dozen houses that were moved into the 34th Street and up into that area of Sehome neighborhood. And trying to track down where some of them came from, we started looking at some of the big moving projects. And another one would have been Bill McDonald Parkway going through here. As you can see, here's where Hagen's is today. It's kind of a farm area. And that was, of course, the Bellingham Mall before it was Hagen's in the 70s. You can also see this A-frame dealership, if anyone remembers, the Roger Jobs Volkswagen dealership, which came in the late 60s along there. My parents bought some cars there. And to look at the other side of the hill, and Sehome High School came in around the same time as the Parkway was put through. And we looked at this picture because you can see a lot of houses are in the Happy Valley neighborhood were moved off their foundations. In this photo, you can see some. Sehome goes in here. And this arrow is pointing to a little house that actually has survived. It's about one of the only things in that neighborhood. Here's Sehome High School today. Here's that little house. And there it is again, right across from the State Archives. Just a fun fact. These houses were two that I was able to track down permits and find out where they came from their original sites. At 3310 Abbott Street was moved from Jersey Street in 1982, and the hospital expanded parking. And it was originally lived in by Ludwig and Albina Laznica. It's a darling little house. And this one on 34th Street, a little craftsman, was moved right from Samish Way in 1983. It was surrounded by that, the trailer court, which sort of evolved over time as well, and the house predated the trailer court, but the trailer court came to be all around this little house, and then eventually they sort of pushed the trailer court back up and moved the house, and they put in, I think it's like Arby's and some little strip mall along Samish Way in the 80s. So that's an example of how the evolution has sort of changed the neighborhood over time. Bernadette?
I'm going to talk a little bit about what the process is. And so, how exactly we go around doing what it is we do. And here we see it. Usually we try for spring when it's not quite leafed out, so it's never nice and warm and toasty. So really the first thing, we go back and forth between office and field work phases. And first, we put in the office, we assemble the team, and we get the data ready to go. And really what's key is that we get a list of all the addresses within the area that we're going to look at. And that usually just includes the address and a date, which is supplied originally from the county assessor. So you get a long list, and we all head out into the field, where the very first thing we do is we take a picture of all the resources that are older than 50 years of age. And I wanted to mention too that we included the Sehome Historic District as part of the photography, so that there'll be a complete photo record of all the buildings, despite the fact that we didn't do any further research on the existing historic district. So what we do is we take a picture of the main resource, the house, and of any outbuildings that might exist. And this is one of Brent Bodie's photos of an outbuilding off the alley. And it's very helpful to have one team member to go down all the alleys and track down all those buildings. That save us about half the shoe leather if we do that. So we're going to follow this little house on High Street throughout this process here to how we go through it. So for field work, the first thing you do is we look at some of the major elements that are considered important to as a house's character-defining features, and ones that are hard to see on a photo. So we look at the building's siding, which in this case is wood. We look at its windows, which here are also wood. Foundation material, which is brick. And we also check the assessor date. Sometimes there is no date, especially on commercial buildings in these records. Sometimes there's no house on the lot, so we skip that if it's been demolished. Sometimes there's something new there, or sometimes the date is just inexplicably off. So we just sort of do a cursory check to make sure that the house that's listed as at the address roughly dates to the 1908 date, which in this case, 1908 is a good date. And we do sort of an evaluation of alterations, and there are 4 degrees of alterations. The house can be intact in its historic materials, it can be slightly altered, it can be moderately altered, or it can be extensively altered. And we'll go into that a little bit more later, what all those mean. So we do a quick evaluation of what we think. So for this one, the plan is probably slightly altered because this dormer looks a little bit off. The siding appears to be historically correct or intact, and so do the windows, in this case, intact. Another possible alteration is there's this post here looks a little too simple, and these steps have been rebuilt. So you might note that. So then what we do is we go back to the office with all this. We enter our photos and all the information we just collected into a database. We add some new information, additional information to the database based on based on looking at our photos. So things we can determine from photos are the architectural style, the plan shape, the roof type, the roofing material, the number of stories, and all that. So we enter all that, and then that combined with what we've recorded in the field becomes a new form. And then instead of having a list of all the addresses, we go back into the field with individual forms for each house that we looked at, and we double check everything to make sure there have been no typos based on crappy handwriting when you're in the field, or that all the areas have been covered. So in this case, as you can see, no one entered the plan shape, so we add that plan shape while we're in the field for a second time. We describe the window a little bit more, and all these are check marks. We look at some of the details of the roof and any kind of decorative elements. We note if there are dormers, any chimneys, any bays, and you can see right over here there's a little three-sided bay. Another sort of decorative element, this is a water table here, a final trim piece. We note sometimes in Bellingham we found that there's a really spectacular collection of historic front doors. So if we can see a nice front door, we'll note that it appears to have its original front door or door that is from the period that the house was built. And then we note anything else that amuses us that we think might be the case. And here, this is a thumbnail that we've generated. So this is an older historic photo. It looks like there's something going on here, but this will have to be looked at again in the office. So we head back to the office and we do more sort of verification. First we look at aerials, and that's in part to see if there's any strange additions that we couldn't see from the public right-of-way in front of the house. In this case it's obscured by trees, but you get the idea. You can see the big dormer that we saw. And then we look at Sanborn historic maps, and these were made for a fire insurance company as part of sort of a risk assessment process, but they entered a lot of detail about neighborhoods and things like that, like water lines and stuff, that can be very indicative of what was there. So here, this is the Sanborn maps were periodically updated and refreshed. So this is the 1950 version, and this is black and white because it's available through a public database that some library subscribes to. And you can see here that there's the plan of the house as we know it. There's a little bay drawn right here, and there's the little inset porch that it has. So in 1950, the house looked about the same way as it did, as it does now. And then 1931, the addition. This is actually what they originally looked like, the Sanborn maps. They're in color, and there's color coding. So a yellow building means it's a wood frame building. Now, if we'd see this pink, that would signal it was a brick building, and we'd have to look at it all over again, trying to wonder why is there a brick building in 1931, and what we see now is clearly wood. In 1913, again, the house looks just like we know it now, one story. Here's this little one that indicates it's one story with a little inset porch, a bay, a back porch, which we couldn't see because it's in the back. No garages or outbuildings in any of these, so we're not sure when that garage that we photographed was built. And then the 1904 edition, the lot is blank. So that way we know that this 1908 date that was supplied by the county assessor seems like a pretty good bet. It's built sometime after 1904, but definitely before 1913. So we've sort of confirmed the construction date, or in some cases we've established a construction date if there was no previous date supplied. Then we do some double checking in the historic photos. We have usually assessor photos, some fairly new. This is a 2004 photo with showing the dormer as it is now. And here's an older photo. Many of these are from the 30s, some from the 50s. And we see that it originally had a front dormer. And I wonder about this sort of paint line here on the roof, if that has anything to do with rebuilding the roof after the dormer was filled in or what. And same thing appears here, so I'm not sure about that. But it definitely shows that this side dormer new, the front dormer missing. And here, this is kind of fuzzy, so it's not entirely indicative, but this looks like it had a slightly fancier little column here rather than just a simple post that we see now. Then so everything we've just done is used to create a verbal description, which don't read it, it's not that exciting, and a statement of significance, which at this level of survey is fairly generic. It's just sort of a general statement about the neighborhood and includes whether the house, based on its intactness, could be eligible for a historic district or individually on the National Register. But so those statements, all the research then is used to generate a form. And so this is the completed survey form, and that one will be available online through the City of Bellingham for people to access and look up their houses with all the basic elements and then the verbal, physical description and statement of significance. And a lot of the statements of significance are expanded because Colby and Lynette can't stop themselves from researching things. So instead of having that generic one, there'll be a custom statement for many of these resources.
So I'm now going to talk about the findings, what has come of all this work that we've done. 545 parcels were surveyed. That's 731 parcels are in all of Sehome neighborhood, and then 186 of those parcels are the Sehome Hill Historic District. So those we cut out automatically, and all we did was take photographs, as said earlier. So 545 parcels is what we looked at. 354 principal structures on those 545 parcels. So a lot of blank lots and a lot of things built after 1965 that we did not look at. And then associated with those 354 principal structures are 138 outbuildings. So garages, sheds, anything that has a permanent foundation. So we ended up looking at quite a number of resources in that donut area around the Sehome Hill Historic District. As Bernadette mentioned, 354 forms for our pre-1965 resources, and then all that in a couple weeks will be out on the state historic website called WISAARD, WISAARD, and it stands for something, Washington something. And then a more friendly service is the City IQ system. So the City of Bellingham has a wonderful GIS system called City IQ that will show you the website at the very end, where you can look up basically all these forms and get some very nice mappage. So we start to digest all this information to get some summary results. I'll leave you hanging on what those summary results will be. So we first look at construction dates. The orange, which is fairly readable, the highest number is 1890 to 1910, so they're in 20-year increments. We see a lot of orange, so we have a lot of that pre-1910, and then blue, 1910 to 1930, so pre-Depression era, basically, housing in our area, with quite a green area. Oop, I got a mouse. Green area down here with the Samish Way area where we have a little later development going on. Construction dates, if we plot them out on a graph, we have a high concentration around 1890, 1900, and 1910, and those are our approximate construction dates giving those spikes. But you can definitely see nearly 50% of our construction is pre-1910. So it is an older neighborhood. I mean, we're just seeing the obvious right now in the numbers. Style is another thing we analyze and put together for our summary report. A lot of styles, and everybody wants to be different. So there is a variety of styles, especially in the 20s and the late 20s when the styles were exploding. We had we had Beaux-Arts, we had Colonial, we had Tudor, Mediterranean, all vying for prominence in our neighborhood. But our concentration is the older styles, the Queen Anne, so around 1890s, arts and crafts in the 1920s, the bungalow movement, and then American Foursquare, kind of providing the transition between Queen Anne and around 1900, 1910 into the arts and crafts. Just the most common styles here, Queen Anne, here's the Morse house everybody knows. Ignore the right-hand side of that photo. That's a later addition. I should have taken this a little bit more the other way, but we have to show everything. So Queen Anne's showing this is really the epitome of Queen Anne. We have a tower, we have porch, we have stickwork, we have every single window is practically different on there, siding types galore. That's the Queen Anne when labor was cheap and materials were plentiful. Foursquare coming in as a more practical housing unit around 1910. No wasted space in this. 4 rooms upstairs, 2 by 2, downstairs 2 by 2, 2 stories high. It's Foursquare. It's classic box is another one of its terms, one of its names. And then arts and crafts is the bungalow movement, the craftsman movement here in the U.S. All in the 1915 to 1925, we see a strong concentration of bungalows in all of Bellingham and definitely in our neighborhood. Excuse me. So integrity. The big thing we look at is integrity, to see the big buildup. We're building towards potential historic districts. We want to see how intact our neighborhood is. We want to look at it with a jaded eye to make sure we're seeing it as objectively as possible. So integrity, I just want to differentiate integrity versus condition. Integrity is how much original material is part of the house or still remains on the house, the windows, the siding, the plan shape, like the Morse house, we saw the large addition on the side. Those are all integrity. Condition is how good a shape it is. So you can have a house that's completely dilapidated but has all its original parts. And people like me get excited about that because it has great integrity and the price might be lower on the market. The three main elements we look at for integrity are plan, so that footprint that the house has, is it intact? Has it had a large addition? Is the addition on the back where it's not visible from the public right away? Siding, does it have its original wood siding or is it now hardy plank or vinyl? Windows, same sort of thing. Are they now vinyl windows? Have the windows openings enlarged? That's something we would look at and take different views of. And then we throw it into a chart, a little digestion system here that we developed actually here in Bellingham back in 2008 to handle huge piles of houses, so that when the house we're looking at the start of the survey and the 1700th house we look at near the end of the survey, we give the same level of critical eye and don't get all jaded and start throwing them into the trash can. So these are the four integrity levels that Bernadette mentioned. And the plan, cladding, windows are the three principal things that elements we look at on a property to evaluate integrity. And this is given to us, dictated by the state of Washington. And basically, if a house is intact across the board, then it's going to be something that might be eligible for, or is likely eligible for a historic district and maybe even individual listing on the National Register. If it has a couple slights, then it's probably contributing to a historic district but might not be eligible individually for the National Register. If we start getting maybe two moderates, because it's had its siding completely replaced and it has a huge addition off the side that's very visible from the right of way, then maybe we're looking at something that wouldn't be contributing to a historic district and is really most likely not eligible for the National Register individually. But there is possibility that we have to think about these things possibly being altered in the future and restored with in-kind materials. Then you can, in a district, become eligible down the line and maybe become contributing. We don't want to knock them off entirely. So we have three levels of contributing, or I guess levels. Historic contributing, so the house is of the period that we're looking at for a historic district and is intact enough to be contributing to the historic district. Historic non-contributing would be something that's been altered over time to the degree that its original facade, its plan is not readily visible. And then non-historic, non-contributing are those properties that are the 1965 apartment building, the things that do not fit in the historic period. So here's a plainly eligible, obviously eligible historic property, 904 Garden, the Morrison House from 1924, even has its garage there on the street, all intact, siding, windows, plan, all intact, so it would be definitely contributing to a historic district and possibly eligible individually, just as we started to gather some history and we know there is some history behind it. Historic non-contributing, we can be pretty harsh that when we see an asbestos siding, probably from the 1950s, aluminum windows from the 1960s, front porch infill, a metal column from Sears, we start saying that it's likely not eligible and would not contribute to a historic district. But that doesn't mean when we look at the Sanborn map and see its footprint is exactly the same as it was back then, that this building couldn't maybe be restored to be contributing to a historic district. But at this point, we would say it's non-contributing and would not help a historic district. And then non-historic, non-contributing would be a building that's out of time with the neighborhood, regardless of how intact it is. So we went through and did basically this contribution calculation for all the properties and plotted them out on maps to try to figure out where there could potentially be historic districts, where we saw good concentrations of integrity. And to decide on boundaries, there's basically 4 properties. We have historical, physical, temporal, and integral, I guess you would say, integral types of boundaries. And using a combination of these 4, they are not mutually exclusive, we can kind of figure out where the historic district should be. So looking at our neighborhood, historical boundaries, where there's a sense of place where we talk about going somewhere. So it's like Sehome Hill is an area that has a typical name. York neighborhood over here, one that I haven't heard called it, but the Forest Park is a plat right here. That would be a historical boundary that people used to, or still do, talk about this being the York Addition. If this was commonly called the Forest Park plat, that would be a name. But Sehome up here, Sehome Addition, that becomes a naturally historic boundary. Physical boundaries, I-5 is a great physical boundary. Ellis is a strong physical boundary. Any sort of major roadway is a physical boundary. The Arboretum, physical boundary. So we can start seeing physical boundaries around our whole neighborhood, but not quite on our district yet, our potential district. Temporal boundaries, that's the period of time. So concentrations where there's a period of time. We have that 1930s through 40s and 50s down here, but a lot of out of period, a lot of post-1965. Seen some good 1890 to 1910 up here with this orange, the blue 1910, 1930, some good concentrations there. And that's, most historic districts are formed around sort of a core where you go into it and you're stepping back to a period of time. It gives you a feeling of a certain period of time. Integrity boundaries. So right now we've plotted all those contributing properties in fuchsia here, or Kate Newell at the city plotted these all out. And we can kind of see areas where there's good integrity. So over here near the old hospital, that probably wouldn't, we have parking lots, not good integrity. It's not readily apparent. We have some really good integrity down here around State. This is a park here, so that gets automatically contributing there. But not real readily apparent. Not like the Cissna Historic District. We were behind that one, and that one was fuchsia entirely. We also have an interesting factor here that we have so many single-family properties turned to rentals. So we had 80 original use here, 80% single-family residential. All those mansions, single-family, or maybe they were classified as single, but maybe multiple families lived in them, but it was single-family residential. Now, at current use, we're about 50-50 between multifamily, so mansions split into multifamily housing. And a lot of these large-scale houses can take it, that they can be split internally, and the exterior can remain the same. Some get the large additions on the back, which is well hidden and compatible. They can take it too, but some stick out the sides. So it's an extra integrity swipe. So we looked at this, so ta-da. This is the boundaries we came up with after maybe a month worth of sweating over where we could draw historic boundaries. As soon as we started expanding them, it expanded outward to take in everything. But contracting down and really distilling it, we found along Garden Street, and for lack of a better name, North Garden Street Historic District is what we're calling it. So we would recommend a historic district in this area, taking in basically to the alley on either side, so between High and Forest, just to the alley, and down from Holly and up from Oak here. Using this kind of a steep drop-off in here as a boundary, the residential kind of disappearing and turning into commercial, and sort of an integrity line along High. That was very difficult for us because High has some really good properties, but there are also some missing teeth along here too. And then we get to the edge of Western Campus down here that really makes a strong break. So this is what we're recommending. Within this potential historic district, we have 63 principal structures, and 54 of them would be contributing, which is a 86% rate, which anything above 50% is looking pretty good. So it's a lot of contributing properties. And some of the sample resources, in addition to what Lynette showed earlier, actually have addresses on these. There we go. 916 Garden, 1890. Well, that seems wrong. Another house, which I'm not sure of the name, maybe that is 916 Garden. Could be 1890. Checking out sandstone, tacked windows and tacked siding, great garage. First Presbyterian Church, 1910. That's our one non-residential resource in this proposed district. The Isaac Dillon House, 1890. We have a great group of 4 of these gable fronters all in a row, which are fairly exact, except maybe this one in the foreground on the right. And the Dillinger House from 1906, now used as a halfway house. But great resources along Garden. So that is the exciting conclusion of our survey. This all goes into a report, which Katie is doing the final touches on. We'll all be out on the city website, the cob.org website, and you can just search for historic inventory, and you'll be able to see the report. And then also, if you want to look up individual properties in maybe a month, you can search City IQ and look through the City IQ system and see our properties in those individual reports, along with all the others that have been done around the city. So I think that's, and further information, you can even call me. I might pick up, but Katie will definitely pick up. So thank you very much.
Thank you.